The council chamber fell silent when Admiral stood to speak. His forearms trembled as he gripped the speaking podium. Around him sat the representatives of 12 spacefaring civilizations, and every single one of them looked defeated. The war had broken them. 3 years of fighting, the Dominion had reduced the Allied Species Coalition to a shadow of its former glory. Cleared his throat and began speaking in a voice that carried the weight of impossible news. The coalition had lost 60% of its territory. 400 billion citizens now lived under occupation. Their fleets were shattered, their shipyards burned, and their armies scattered across 1,000 dying worlds. He paused and looked at each representative in turn. They had one option remaining. One desperate, terrible option that no one wanted to consider. They had to contact the humans. The chamber erupted in protests. Ambassador of the Collective rose from her seat with her silver scales catching the light as she moved. She reminded the council why humanity had been quarantined 2 centuries ago. The assessment teams had visited Earth and found a nightmare. Humans evolved on a Category 7, where the very environment tried to kill them every day. They developed as persistence predators, hunting their prey not through speed or strength but through sheer endurance. They would chase animals until those animals collapsed from exhaustion. They waged constant war against their own kind. They possessed an unsettling capacity for extreme violence matched only by moments of irrational compassion that made no strategic sense. Slammed her hand on the table. Bringing humans into galactic society would be like releasing a plague. They were too dangerous and too unpredictable and too aggressive. The quarantine existed for good reason. Admiral listened to her arguments and then asked a simple question. What alternative did they have? They were coming for them all. Every species in this chamber would be enslaved or exterminated within the next 2 years. Was their pride worth extinction? The vote happened that same hour. Desperation won by a narrow margin. Commander of the military received his orders the following morning. He was to take a small diplomatic vessel to the Sol system and make first contact with humanity. He was to assess their capabilities and request their aid. He was given full authority to negotiate on behalf of the coalition. Had studied the old assessment reports during his journey. He expected to find a primitive species with basic space travel, probably limited to their own moon or perhaps their nearest planetary neighbor. He expected to find warlike savages who would need careful handling. He was wrong about everything. His ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, and his sensors officer immediately began making sounds of distress, looked at the readings, and felt his blood turn cold. The humans had not stayed primitive. They had built a civilization spanning their entire star system. Massive shipyards orbited the red planet they called Mars, and those shipyards were producing warships at a rate that exceeded coalition standards. Mining operations dotted the asteroid belt, extracting resources with brutal efficiency. Communications satellites formed a web that covered every corner of their territory. Military vessels patrolled in formations that had never seen before, moving with coordination that suggested extensive combat experience. His communication officer reported an incoming transmission. The humans were demanding identification and stating their intention to intercept. Identified himself as a diplomatic envoy from the Allied Species Coalition. He requested permission to approach Earth and speak with human leadership. He waited in silence for their response. The silence lasted 1 hour. Spent that hour watching human patrol ships move closer to his position. They did not threaten him directly, but their presence made the message clear. He was in their territory and they wanted him to remember that fact. Permission finally came. He was directed to land at a specific facility on the North American continent. He was warned that any deviation from the approved flight path would result in immediate destruction. Followed instructions precisely. The landing facility sat in a valley surrounded by mountains. Human soldiers in armored suits waited on the landing pad. They moved with a discipline that recognized from his own military training, but there was something else in the way they carried themselves. A confidence that bordered on arrogance. These soldiers did not fear him. They did not seem to fear anything. A human delegation approached his ship. 2 individuals led the group. The first was a female named Marsh who held the title of Secretary of Defense. The second was a male named Daniel Cole who held the rank of Fleet Admiral. Both wore dark formal clothing and neither smiled. Explained the situation. He told them about the Dominion and the 3 years of war. He described the coalition's losses and the millions of civilians suffering under occupation. He asked for humanity's help. Daniel Cole listened without interrupting. When finished speaking, the admiral asked one question. His voice was calm and his eyes were hard. Why should we help the species that locked us away? Had no good answer. The quarantine had been cruel, and the reasons behind it had been based on fear rather than evidence. Humanity had been in contact with the galactic community for 2 centuries simply because they were considered too dangerous. They had been left alone to develop without guidance or trade or cultural exchange. Marsh spoke next. She told that humanity had known about the quarantine for decades. They had intercepted coalition communications and decoded their languages. They had watched the galactic community from afar and they had seen the war begin. They knew everything. Asked why they had not reached out. Daniel Cole laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He explained that humanity had considered reaching out many times. They had debates and discussions and arguments about whether to reveal themselves. But every time, they remembered how the coalition had treated them. They remembered being judged and found wanting before they even had a chance to speak. Marsh took over. She told that humanity would hear his proposal. They would consider helping the coalition, but they would do so on their own terms and in their own time. He was to remain on Earth as their guest while negotiations continued. Agreed, he had no other choice. The negotiations lasted 2 weeks. During that time, was given limited access to human society. He walked through their cities and visited their museums and observed their daily lives. What he saw confused him deeply. Humans were violent. Their history was filled with wars and atrocities and acts of terrible cruelty. But humans were also capable of extraordinary kindness. He watched them care for their sick and elderly. He saw them build shelters for those without homes. He observed their art and music and literature, all of it expressing emotions that could barely comprehend. These creatures were not the monsters the coalition had feared. They were something far more complicated. They were capable of being the worst thing in the galaxy or the best thing in the galaxy, and the choice seemed to be entirely their own. Sent his first report to the council. He told them to prepare themselves. Humanity was coming. And the galaxy would never be the same. The Coalition Council received Commander's reports with growing unease. He described a species that every expectation. Humans were not primitive savages. They had developed technologies that matched or exceeded Coalition standards in several fields. Their medical science could regrow lost limbs. Their engineering could build structures that withstood earthquakes and hurricanes. Their computers processed information at speeds that made Coalition systems look ancient. But it was their military that truly frightened the Council. Had been given a tour of a human training facility. He watched soldiers run through obstacle courses that would kill most Coalition species. They crawled through mud and climbed walls and swam through freezing water. They fought each other with padded weapons until blood flowed freely. They pushed their bodies past every reasonable limit and then pushed further. A human officer named Colonel Ben Harrison explained the philosophy behind their training. Humans believed that combat was chaos. No plan survived contact with the enemy. The only way to prepare soldiers for that chaos was to expose them to suffering during training. A soldier who had experienced pain and exhaustion and fear in controlled conditions would not panic when facing those same conditions in actual combat. Asked about their ships, Colonel Harrison smiled and took him to a shipyard. Human warships were ugly. Coalition vessels were sleek and elegant, designed with attention to aesthetic beauty. Human ships were blocky and angular, covered in armor plating that made them look like flying fortresses. Every surface was functional. Every system had backups and redundancies. These ships were not built to look impressive. They were built to take damage and keep fighting. The weapon systems were equally brutal. Human missiles carried warheads designed to punch through shields and detonate inside enemy hulls. Their energy weapons drew power directly from the main reactor, sacrificing efficiency for raw destructive force. Their close-range cannons fired projectiles at speeds that could shatter asteroid rock. Asked what doctrine they used in combat, Colonel Harrison said one word: aggression. Human military doctrine emphasized attacking the enemy before the enemy could attack them. It emphasized closing distance quickly and engaging at ranges where their heavy armor gave them advantage. It emphasized never retreating unless ordered to do so by a superior officer. Returned to his quarters that night and sat in darkness for a long time. He understood now why the coalition had quarantined humanity. These people were terrifying. Their entire civilization was built around the assumption that violence was inevitable, and the only response to violence was greater violence. But he also understood something else. If the coalition wanted to survive, they needed exactly this kind of ally. Secretary of Defense Marsh presented humanity's terms 3 days later. She sat across from in a conference room decorated with flags from human nations that had once been independent countries. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole stood behind her with his arms crossed over his chest. The terms were simple but significant. Humanity would enter the war against the Dominion. They would commit their full military strength to the coalition cause. They would fight until the enemy was defeated or until every human soldier was dead. In return, humanity wanted 3 things. First, they wanted full coalition membership after the war ended. No restrictions, no limitations, no special conditions. They would be treated as equals. Second, they wanted access to all records related to the quarantine. They wanted to know exactly what had been said about them and who had said it. Third, they wanted their sovereignty recognized across all territories they liberated. Any world they freed from occupation would have the option of joining the human sphere of influence. Transmitted the terms to the Coalition Council. The response was immediate and chaotic. The collective refused outright. Ambassador declared that humanity was using the war as an excuse to expand their territory. She accused them of planning to replace thee as the dominant power in the galaxy. She demanded additional restrictions on human military operations. The hierarchy voiced similar concerns. Their representative argued that human sovereignty over liberated worlds would create an empire that threatened everyone. They wanted coalition observers embedded in every human fleet. Admiral listened to the arguments and then stood to speak. His voice was tired but firm. He reminded the council that they were losing the war. Every day brought more reports of fallen worlds and slaughtered civilians. They were not stopping. They would not negotiate. They wanted conquest and enslavement and nothing less. Humanity was offering to fight that enemy. Yes, their terms were aggressive. Yes, their expansion would change the balance of power. But what good was balance of power if everyone was dead? The vote lasted 3 days. Species argued and threatened and bargained. Alliances shifted and reformed. Ancient grudges surfaced and new resentments were born. In the end, desperation won again. The coalition accepted humanity's terms. On Earth, President Brooks addressed the United Nations General Assembly. The chamber was packed with representatives from every human nation. Cameras broadcast his words to billions of viewers across the solar system. President Brooks explained the situation clearly. The galaxy was at war. Civilizations were burning. Billions of innocent people were suffering under enemy occupation. And the coalition that had imprisoned humanity for 2 centuries was now begging for help. He paused and looked out at the assembly. Some would say they should refuse. Some would say the coalition deserved to fall. Some would say humanity owed nothing to species that had feared and rejected them. President Brooks disagreed. Humanity had a choice. They could stand aside and watch the galaxy burn, knowing they had the power to help but choosing not to use it. Or they could enter the war and fight for people they had never met, protect civilizations that had wronged them, and prove that humanity was better than the fear that had created the quarantine. The choice was clear: humanity would fight. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole took command of the 1st Expeditionary Force the following week. 12 carrier groups assembled in orbit above Mars. 400 warships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to nimble destroyers, formed up in precise formation. 2 million soldiers waited in transport vessels, ready to deploy wherever they were needed. Lieutenant Commander Grace Porter stood at her station aboard the carrier USS Relentless. She was 28 years old, and she had spent the last 3 years studying tactics and weapon systems. She knew their strengths and weaknesses better than almost anyone in the fleet. Grace Porter watched the fleet assemble through her tactical display. She had never seen anything like it. The sheer scale of human military power, concentrated in one place for one purpose, was overwhelming. Admiral Cole's voice came through the ship's communication system. He told the fleet that they were about to enter the most important war in human history. They would face an enemy that had conquered dozens of civilizations. They would fight battles that would determine the fate of countless worlds. He did not promise them victory. He did not promise them survival. He promised them only that their sacrifice would mean something. Every human who fell in this war would fall protecting those who could not protect themselves. The fleet entered hyperspace. The journey would take 6 days. Grace Porter spent those 6 days reviewing battle plans and running simulations. She barely slept. She barely ate. Her mind was consumed by one thought. Humanity had never lost a war they committed to winning. She intended to keep that record intact. The first expeditionary force dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Lieutenant Commander Grace Porter immediately began scanning for enemy contacts. Her displays filled with red icons almost instantly. 200 warships held position around the fourth planet. They had arranged themselves in a defensive formation that protected the orbital stations and ground installations. Their weapons were powered and their shields were active. They had been expecting coalition forces to attempt a liberation. They had not been expecting humans. Supreme Commander commanded the defensive fleet from his flagship. He received reports of unknown vessels entering the system and dismissed them with a wave of his clawed hand. The coalition was broken. These were probably refugee ships or perhaps pirates hopping to scavenge from the occupied world. He ordered a patrol squadron to investigate and identify. The patrol squadron transmitted their findings 2 minutes later. Their voices carried a tone that had never heard from soldiers before: fear. The unknown vessels were human warships, 400 of them. They were not approaching cautiously like coalition forces always did. They were accelerating directly toward the defensive formation at speeds that should tear their hulls apart. Demanded confirmation. The patrol squadron confirmed. The humans were coming and they were coming fast. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole stood on the bridge of the USS Relentless and watched the formation grow larger on the main display. His officers waited for orders. His hands rested calmly at his sides. He gave one command: break them. The human fleet slammed into the defensive line like a hammer striking glass. There was no hesitation, no probing attacks, no careful testing of enemy defenses. Human ships drove straight into the heart of the enemy formation and opened fire with everything they had. Grace Porter coordinated the tactical response from her station. Her fingers flew across her console as she directed squadrons, adjusted firing solutions, and tracked enemy movements. The chaos of battle surrounded her, but her mind remained cold and focused. Human ships absorbed punishment that would have destroyed coalition vessels 3 times over. A destroyer took 6 direct hits to its forward armor and kept advancing. A cruiser lost its port engine array and simply rotated to present its undamaged side while continuing to fire. A carrier launched fighter craft even as enemy missiles detonated against its hull. They had never faced an enemy like this. Their doctrine was built around the assumption that opponents would retreat when losses became severe. Every species they had conquered followed the same pattern: fight, take losses, withdraw to regroup. The coalition had been particularly predictable in this regard. Humans did not retreat, they pushed harder. Watched in horror as his defensive formation crumbled. Human ships punched through gaps in his lines and began targeting his support vessels. His ammunition transports exploded. His repair ships fled. His communication relays went dark one by one. He ordered a counterattack. His remaining squadrons formed up and charged the human flagship directly. They would kill the enemy commander and break the human morale. The USS Relentless turned to meet them. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole did not flinch as enemy fire splashed against his shields. He did not panic as damage reports flooded in from across his ship. He simply gave orders in a calm voice and trusted his crew to execute them. Grace Porter identified the incoming attack and calculated a response. She directed the carrier's defensive batteries to concentrate fire on the lead enemy ships. She called for fighter support from neighboring vessels. She plotted an evasion course that would expose the attackers to crossfire from multiple human ships. The counterattack failed, lost 20 ships in 6 minutes. He watched the human flagship emerge from the chaos undamaged and still firing. Ground forces began deploying while the space battle still raged. Transport ships carrying Marine battalions descended through the atmosphere, their hulls glowing from friction heat. Anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them. Some transports exploded. The others kept coming. Colonel Ben Harrison led the ground assault. His Marines secured a landing zone under heavy enemy fire and immediately began pushing toward the labor camps where 3 million civilians were held prisoner. They did not wait for air support. They did not wait for armor reinforcement. They moved with a speed that shocked the defenders. The Battle of Four lasted 6 hours. It should have lasted 6 days. Human Marines cleared the labor camps building by building. They kicked down doors and shot enemy soldiers and carried wounded civilians to safety. They shared their water with dehydrated prisoners. They gave their rations to starving children. They did not stop moving until every camp was liberated. Supreme Commander ordered a withdrawal after losing 140 ships. His remaining 60 vessels fled the system at maximum speed. He expected the humans to pursue. Coalition forces always pursued retreating enemies, hopping to inflict additional casualties. The humans let him go. They had more important work to do. Medical teams deployed across the surface of Four. Human doctors worked through the night treating wounds and diseases that they had allowed to fester. Engineers restored power to civilian sectors. Soldiers distributed food and clean water. The survivors watched in confusion. They had hoped for liberation, but they had expected something different. Coalition forces would have secured the planet and then departed, leaving the rebuilding to local authorities. These humans showed no interest in leaving. An elder approached Colonel Ben Harrison and asked why the humans were helping so much. They had won the battle. They had no obligation to remain. Colonel Harrison looked at the elder for a long moment. Then he explained. Humans did not fight just to win battles. They fought to make things better. Victory meant nothing if the people they saved were left to suffer afterward. His soldiers would stay until they could stand on their own again. The elder did not understand. No species in the galaxy behaved this way. Altruism on this scale made no strategic sense. Colonel Harrison smiled sadly. He said that humans had learned something important throughout their violent history. The only battles worth fighting were battles that left the world better than they found it. Everything else was just killing. Ambassador arrived with a coalition observation team 3 days later. She had opposed human contact from the beginning. She had warned the Council that humanity would be dangerous and unpredictable. She walked through the liberated camps and watched human soldiers playing games with children. She saw human doctors teaching local medical staff advanced treatment techniques. She observed human engineers training civilians to maintain the restored infrastructure. A human sergeant ran past her position carrying a dying child. Enemy holdouts had attacked a residential sector, and the child had been caught in the crossfire. The sergeant sprinted through open ground where snipers could easily target him. He did not slow down until he reached the medical station. The child survived. The sergeant received a commendation for bravery. Stood in the ruins of a labor camp, and finally understood why the coalition had feared humanity for 2 centuries. It was not their violence. Many species were violent. It was their compassion. Humans cared about strangers with an intensity that logic. They would risk their lives for people they had never met. They would sacrifice everything to protect those who could not protect themselves. That kind of species could change the galaxy. Sent a report to the Council that night. She told them to support the humans with everything they had. She told them to stop questioning and start cooperating. The war had finally turned. News of the victory at Four spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Coalition species that had surrendered to began to resist again. Partisan movements rose on occupied worlds. Sabotage operations disrupted enemy supply lines. Underground networks smuggled weapons and intelligence to resistance fighters. The Dominion faced something they had not experienced in 3 years of conquest: real opposition. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole divided his forces into 4 battle groups. Each group was assigned to a different sector of coalition space. Human admirals coordinated with coalition commanders, sharing tactics and technology. They taught coalition officers how to fight aggressively. They showed them how to push through losses instead of retreating. Coalition officers were shocked by human planning sessions. Human commanders argued with each other openly. They raised objections and challenged assumptions and questioned every detail of proposed operations. Voices were raised, tables were struck, insults were exchanged. Then they reached consensus and executed their plans with perfect coordination. Admiral asked Fleet Admiral Cole how humans could fight so effectively after arguing so bitterly. Cole explained that humans believed good plans came from honest disagreement. If no one challenged an idea, the flaws in that idea would remain hidden until combat exposed them. Better to find weaknesses in a conference room than on a battlefield. Captain commanded the destroyer USS Steadfast in the liberation of the border systems. Her ship was small compared to the carriers and battleships of the fleet, but she pushed it hard. The Steadfast led the charge in 17 engagements over 4 months. During the battle for Prime, coalition transports carrying 40,000 refugees came under attack from a cruiser squadron. The transports had no weapons and minimal shields. They were sitting targets. Captain ordered her ship into the path of the enemy fire. The Steadfast absorbed 17 direct hits while the transports escaped to safety. Her engines failed. Her weapons went offline. Her hull was breached in 6 places. She got her ship moving again and rejoined the battle. Sergeant First Class Brooks led a special operations team behind enemy lines on the industrial world of 3. His mission was to destroy the primary shipyard supplying the Eastern Fleet. This shipyard produced 30 warships per month. Its destruction would cripple enemy operations for years. The shipyard was guarded by 8,000 troops. Brooks had 12 soldiers. They infiltrated the planet through a maintenance access point in the planetary defense grid. They moved at night and hid during the day. They avoided patrols and bypassed security checkpoints. They spent 14 days working their way toward the shipyard. On the 15th night they struck. Brooks and his team planted explosives at critical structural points throughout the facility. They set timers and began their extraction. Guards discovered them halfway to the exit. A running battle erupted through the corridors of the shipyard. Brooks lost 4 of his soldiers in the fighting. He carried one of them for 2 kilometers before the man died in his arms. The explosives detonated while reinforcements were still pouring into the facility. The shipyard collapsed. Secondary explosions destroyed the surrounding infrastructure. 40,000 enemy troops died in the blast. Brooks escaped with 8 survivors. He had the names of his fallen soldiers tattooed on his arm when he returned to human space. The Dominion Supreme Council convened an emergency session on their capital world. High Sovereign Thorn sat on his throne and demanded answers. His military had conquered 43 civilizations. They had never faced meaningful resistance. Now a single species, quarantined for 2 centuries, was tearing their empire apart. Intelligence Director presented her analysis. She had studied human behavior and tactics for months. Her conclusions were disturbing. Humans were not more technologically advanced than their ships were roughly equivalent in capability. Their weapons were powerful but not revolutionary. Their numbers were smaller than forces. But humans had something they did not understand. They were willing to die. Human soldiers did not surrender. They fought until they physically could not continue. Human ships engaged enemies even when outnumbered, and human commanders sacrificed themselves to protect their troops. This behavior made no rational sense. They had built their empire on rational warfare. They calculated acceptable losses, and when those limits were exceeded, they preserved their forces for future operations. They traded territory for time when necessary. Humans ignored these calculations. They treated every battle as if losing was not an option. They threw themselves into combat with an intensity that bordered on madness. Had one recommendation: do not fight humans directly, find another way to break them. High Sovereign Thorn considered her words. Then he ordered a change in strategy. If humans could not be defeated in direct combat, they would be broken through terror. The Dominion would target human civilian populations. They would make Earth itself burn. A strike force of 300 warships assembled in secret. It was the largest fleet assembled in a decade. Their orders were simple: travel to the Sol system, destroy human orbital infrastructure, bombard Earth until the surface was uninhabitable. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole received intelligence about the strike force from coalition spy networks. His staff expected him to order an immediate return to defend Earth. Human forces were scattered across coalition space. Concentrating them would take weeks. Cole did not order a retreat. He smiled. Lieutenant Commander Grace Porter asked why he seemed pleased. The enemy was about to attack their families were in danger. Admiral Cole explained. Every enemy in human history had made the same mistake. They believed that attacking human homes would break human will. They believed that threatening civilians would force humans to surrender. It never worked. It only made humans angry. But we're about to learn what happened when humanity got angry. Cole sent orders to all human forces across Coalition space. Do not return to Earth. Continue offensive operations. Press the attack harder than ever. He sent a different message to Earth, one word. Prepare. Secretary of Defense Marsh received the message in her office in Geneva. She had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Contingency plans went into effect immediately. Every orbital station, every mining platform, every cargo vessel in the Sol system received new orders. Arm yourselves. The enemy is coming. The galaxy was about to witness something it had never seen before. Humanity defending its home. And humanity did not know how to lose on home ground. The strike force entered the Sol system expecting minimal resistance. Intelligence reports indicated that most human warships were deployed across Coalition space. Earth should be vulnerable. High Commander led the assault personally. He had conquered 17 worlds in his career. This would be his 18th. His sensors officer reported contacts ahead. 200 human warships formed a defensive line between the strike force and Earth. The second and third home defense fleets had been held in reserve for exactly this moment. Was not concerned. His force outnumbered the defenders significantly. He ordered his fleet to advance. Then his sensors officer began detecting additional contacts, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Every orbital station in the Sol system had been armed. Mining platforms carried military-grade weapons. Cargo vessels bristled with missile launchers. Civilian transports had been converted into improvised warships. Asteroid mining lasers had been repositioned as defensive batteries. The entire Sol system had become a fortress. Secretary of Defense Marsh coordinated the defense from a bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains. She had spent 2 years preparing for this day. Every human in the system had a role. Factory workers became gunners. Miners became engineers. Teachers became medics. The entire civilian population had mobilized for war. Hesitated for the first time in his military career. His tactical officers calculated the odds and recommended withdrawal. The defending force was too strong. The losses would be unacceptable. Rejected their recommendation. High Sovereign Thorn had ordered Earth destroyed. He would not return empty-handed. The strike force advanced. The Battle of Sol began with long-range missile exchanges. Human defensive platforms launched thousands of warheads at the approaching enemy fleet. Point defense systems destroyed most of them, but some got through. Explosions rippled across the strike force formation. Ordered his ships to increase speed. They would push through the missile fire and engage the human fleet directly. Coalition species always broke when the enemy closed to decisive range. The human fleet did not break, they charged. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole brought the first expeditionary force out of hyperspace directly behind the formation. 400 warships appeared where there had been empty space moments before. The enemy fleet was caught between 2 human forces and a star system full of armed civilians. Realized his mistake too late. He had not been lured into a trap. He had walked into an execution. The Battle of Sol lasted 18 hours. It was the bloodiest engagement in human history. Captain commanded the USS Steadfast on the front line of the defensive fleet. Her ship had never fully recovered from the damage it took at Prime. Her crew was exhausted. Her weapons were operating at 60% capacity. A dreadnought broke through the human line and began accelerating toward a civilian evacuation transport. 20,000 people were aboard that transport, families with children, elderly who could not fight, the sick and wounded. Captain ordered her ship to intercept. Her officers protested. The Steadfast could not survive a direct engagement with a dreadnought. She gave the order anyway. The Steadfast rammed the dreadnought at full speed. The collision tore both ships apart. Captain had ordered her crew to abandon ship 30 seconds before impact. 47 of her sailors survived. She did not. Lieutenant Commander Grace Porter took command of the USS Relentless after Admiral Harrison fell to a bridge explosion. She was 29 years old. She had never commanded a ship larger than a frigate. She led the carrier group for the remaining 6 hours of combat. Her voice remained steady through every crisis. Her orders were clear and precise. Her tactical decisions saved hundreds of lives and destroyed dozens of enemy ships. When the battle ended, she collapsed at her station from exhaustion. Medical teams had to carry her to sickbay. Sergeant First Class Brooks led boarding parties onto command ships during the final phase of the battle. His orders were to capture enemy leadership for interrogation. He fought through 3 ships with a team of 50 Marines. They cleared corridors room by room, killing enemy soldiers and taking survivors prisoner. Brooks personally dragged High Commander out of his command chair and onto a human transport. The strike force was annihilated, 287 enemy ships destroyed, 13 captured, none escaped. Human losses were severe, 64 warships destroyed, 18,000 military personnel dead, 4 orbital stations obliterated with all hands, civilian casualties numbered in the thousands. But Earth survived, humanity survived. The galaxy watched the aftermath through coalition news networks. They saw humans mourning their dead. They saw memorials being built and names being read. They saw a species grieving for their fallen. Then they saw something else. They saw humans immediately beginning repairs. They saw shipyards resuming production. They saw recruitment centers filled with volunteers. Humanity did not celebrate victory. They prepared to continue. High Sovereign Thorn received the battle report on the Dominion capital world. His military advisors recommended immediate surrender. They had lost 40% of their total fleet strength in 8 months of fighting humans. At this rate, the Dominion would collapse within a year. The High Sovereign refused. He ordered a final offensive, committing every remaining ship to one massive assault. They would crush the humans through sheer numbers or die trying. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole met this offensive at the border world of Prime. The combined human and coalition fleet numbered 900 vessels, the Brought 1,100. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Dominion surrendered unconditionally. The Galactic Council convened 6 months later to formalize peace. Humanity received full coalition membership without restrictions. They received an official apology for the quarantine. They received recognition of sovereignty over all territories they had liberated. Ambassador of the Collective presented the apology personally. She had spent months studying human history. She understood now what made them different. Humans were not dangerous because they were violent. Many species were violent. Humans were dangerous because they cared. They fought not for conquest or resources but for people they had never met. They protected species that had wronged them. They defended principles that offered no material benefit. The galaxy had trembled when humanity entered the war because, for the first time, they faced a species that would never stop fighting, not until everyone was safe. Fleet Admiral Daniel Cole retired 3 years after the war ended. He spent his remaining days teaching at the Naval Academy, training the next generation of officers. Students asked him what lesson he wanted them to remember most. He gave the same answer every time. We do not fight because we hate what is in front of us. We fight because we love what is behind us. Grace Porter rose to the rank of Admiral. Brooks became the most decorated soldier in human history. The name of captain was given to a new class of destroyers. And the galaxy never forgot the day humanity entered the war. All doubt was gone.